This is episode 9 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 9 is titled The Brain and Filters, Part 1. Before we get to the meat of today's episode, as a reminder for those of you who feel like you've got a lot of info coming at you all at once during any given episode, hit that pause button and let your brain process and catch up. I haven't included any particular breaks in the episodes, like with musical interludes, because I'm relying on you to have the awareness of when your brain has had enough for the time being. You've got some responsibility here too to put these ideas into action. Today I'm going to forego the usual introductory reminder that the mission of this podcast series is to reduce miscommunication, misunderstandings, arguments, and stress. I'm also not going to talk about another big benefit that it'll free up your time to do more things of more interest to you, since you won't be wasting your time on those 4 things I just mentioned anymore. Plus, since this is episode 9 already, and you've no doubt been listening to these episodes in numerical order as suggested, there's no need to cover the fact that beyond your personal life, if you apply these things at your work, the business environment will improve and you'll be happier there too. And unless you're a business owner or executive officer or just someone who cares about the company you work for, I don't need to mention that if these communication tools are applied more widely in a deliberate program, business profitability also increases. So, if I'm not going to talk about all of that, what will we talk about? Well, in short, the brain and how the brain filters your thoughts to produce situations that aren't based in reality oftentimes. I've been waiting for this episode titled The Brain and Filters Part 1 because after all of the years spent in the pursuit of creating effective communication, I personally find this topic to be one of the most fascinating. My formal educational background is filled with science. That appeals to the logical side of me, which is most of me. The more I read and heard about the brain, the more surprised I became. You see, the brain is almost like an alien being inside of your body. Kind of has a mind of its own, literally. You could almost say that about any organ in the body, though, if you take the analogy far enough. So, for example, the heart kind of does its own thing, too. You don't consciously control the heart unless you're an expert at meditation or a monk or something or someone who can consciously slow down their heartbeat. The heart doesn't really care about the rest of your body. It just does what it does on its own. So in that respect, it's also kind of like an alien in your body. You could say that about virtually any organ in the body. But the brain is different. Perhaps even more alien than any other organ. It controls all of the other organs with a kind of an autopilot approach to making them all function. Without getting into religious aspects of the soul and belief systems, it's fair to say that the brain does its own thing when it wants to. Boiled down to its essence, the brain is still just a mechanical object, subject to the laws of all mechanical objects. It's subject to failure. It has connections in it that produce thought, but those connections are mechanical ones, albeit in an electrical or chemical form. If a given connection fails, then something will be altered in the production of a given thought. You might start out on the path of a particular judgment or conclusion, but if that path is interrupted, your judgment may be changed from what it might have otherwise been. Here's the most surprising finding about the brain that I've learned and that opened up my mind to so many possibilities and consequences for achieving effective communication. Donna Bridge was a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. She documented a few years ago that now I'm hoping she graduated, but let's just assume that and move on. Here's what she documented a few years ago, that the brain does 2 things with memories. It alters them, and it believes that it hasn't altered them. The part of the brain altering memories on its own is interesting. The part about the brain believing that it hasn't altered them is why many people get locked into positions and won't budge. That's the dangerous part of Donna Bridge's findings from an effective communication standpoint. Now think about that. Memories are simply connections among a specific sequence of synapses in the brain. Synapses are simply physical connections of brain cells that allow electrical or chemical signals to pass between the cells, which produces thought, among other things. However, the brain, on its own, and because it is a mechanical object, can and does shift some synapses from between cells A and B to, say, cells A and C. You have no control over what the brain does in linking those cells. So, and again, remember that this is just my simplified interpretation of an extraordinarily complex process. If cells A and B, with a synapse in between them, defines the color green for you in your memory, then if now your color memory gets shifted to cells A and C, your memory may change to the color blue. You can't control that process. The brain may just randomly make that change on its own. So when you're telling your story from a memory from many years ago, or even recently for that matter, you may have told the story earlier using the color green. But years later, after the brain has shifted that synapse to different cells, you may tell the story using the color blue. Or the brain may simply dissolve that synapse and you won't have any memory of any color associated with that story. The more you use that particular memory, the stronger the synapse becomes, so it registers in your long-term memory as a solid bit of information. But another fact that's just recently come out is that the more the brain accesses a certain memory, the more likely there is that damage is created to cells and the synapses. Eventually, the memory, even if initially strongly held in long-term memory, may get changed, sometimes in small details and sometimes in larger views. So out of all this, just remember that every time you remember something, the memory gets physically nibbled away a bit. It degrades a little bit, sometimes significantly, even that memory of the fact that you've just learned and created in your head. Now, I used to be a fan of Brian Williams, well, actually still am, who used to be the anchor on NBC Nightly News. You may remember a few years ago that Brian was famously let go of his position or fired from his position because he had continued to tell this story over and over again about how when he was on assignment somewhere, he was in a helicopter and the helicopter there was an explosion nearby and the helicopter got hit by flak and had to land, and he was in that helicopter that happened to. Well, it turned out that actually Brian wasn't in that helicopter. A helicopter in front of him actually got hit by flak and had to land, and he was in the helicopter behind it. But over time, Brian had told this story so much that in his own mind, his brain had changed the situation to conflate the two different incidents. So he was in a helicopter behind the helicopter that got hit, and he saw the helicopter get hit. So his brain somehow conflated those two things, and conflate means to just kind of mesh the two things together. And he became convinced that he was in the helicopter that had been hit by flak and had to land. Now, as a result of that, and there was documentation to prove otherwise, that in fact he was in the helicopter that was not hit, he was accused of lying. Now, and subsequently fired. Now, I actually don't think that Brian Williams believed that he was lying. He thought he was telling the truth, but only because his brain had acted in such a way as to switch the synapses around and degrade some and enhance others. And all of a sudden now he had this story in his brain that he thought was actually true, but wasn't. Now, the result was he lost his job. Was that fair? Well, I don't know. But knowing what I know about the brain and now what you know about the brain, I'm more inclined to give Brian the benefit of the doubt, because really He had nothing to gain from lying about that situation. So, are you with me so far? We're going to get into the practical effects of all of the stuff we just discussed in a few minutes relative to effective communication, so hang with me. So you think you've got a good memory? Well, I submit this caution to you to not get too full of yourself. It's an interesting cultural phenomenon that when two people try to share a memory of an event that they both experienced at the same time from some years ago, that there'll inevitably be differences in those memories. Usually it's in the details versus the overall memory. For example, when my wife and I talk about our trip to Monaco a few years ago, we both clearly remember that we both took a trip together to Monaco a few years ago. Now ask us about the details of that trip, and things start to break down. She remembers a great lunch sitting outside at a cafe that we just happened to find. However, she doesn't remember me waxing philosophic about the beer I had had with lunch, a Peroni, and my first ever Peroni, and it tasted great. It just hit the spot for me on that hot afternoon and went exceedingly well with whatever it was that I had for lunch. One of the best beer experiences I've had as to how truly refreshing it was. My mouth is watering just from talking about it. But I don't remember what we ate. Terry does. I might describe the scene of us sitting under an umbrella in the shade. She might say that there was no umbrella at all, although we were definitely in the shade. And here's where the communication might go off track. I might insist that we sat under an umbrella. She might insist that we didn't. We might go back and forth a couple of times with both of us so certain about our memories that the discussion turns into an argument. If you'll remember, to the extent that you can, from previous episodes, and that's when the fight started. Each of us so locked into our infallible memories that neither one of us is willing to give in. We might not even consciously think we're that locked in, but we are. The discussion devolves into an I'm right and you're wrong from both sides. Now, this argument didn't really happen, but does it sound familiar to you? Been in similar circumstances? Clearly, ineffective communication is occurring. So how do you get out of it if you find yourself in it? We learned this trick from a couple who lived down a few houses from us on our block and who we coincidentally ran into on that vacation. Small world, huh? Anyway, they said when they reach that point of disagreement about something, one of them will say the words, you may be right. They reached that conclusion that there was no point in arguing over fallible memories, and so conceded that the other person may in fact be right. They might have been. Of course, the unspoken assumption there is that you may be wrong, but they decided to put a positive spin on those situations. It became a signal for each other that there's no point in arguing about essentially an insignificant issue, so why not accommodate the other person and agree that they may be right? There's no way to prove conclusively that there was or wasn't an umbrella, unless we had a picture of the scene. So a truce is declared with the words, you may be right. So here's your first tool of the day for you. You may be right. It's a very, very, very useful tool in preventing arguments over essentially trivial things. So now you have some scientifically based knowledge that the brain alters memories on its own and also thinks that it hasn't altered anything. And awareness of this fact is an important tool in and of itself because it interacts with other communication tools. Remember, if you can, to the degree that you think is accurate, our discussion about the importance of awareness from episode 7. If you're aware of this scientific fact, then perhaps you'll open your mind to the utilization of a tool that we learned about also in episode 7, that being to enter a conversation with the thought that I may be wrong. Because if you know for a scientific fact that the brain screws with your memories on its own, then hopefully you'll at least have a seed of doubt about whether you're actually right and not be so cocksure and locked in on your position, and thus more willing to admit you may be wrong. This bit of humble pie will help you avoid arguments in the future. Let's move to a related issue with the brain, and that is filters. Think about all of the sensory input your brain receives every second of the day. Much like the exercise I ask you to do to actively seek out all assumptions that may be in play in a given conversation, which resulted in finding hundreds and hundreds of assumptions in any given day, the number of sensory inputs that your brain receives during the day are all of those numbers times about a gazillion. Just think about all of the stuff you're seeing at this very second as you listen to this podcast. All of the stuff that appears in your peripheral vision right now. If you think about each of those individual things that you're seeing, and it's a lot, almost overwhelming if you were to list everything, and that's an understatement. Your brain has a natural, what I call a significance filter, that's in the on position all the time. Not everything in life is significant. In fact, most things aren't. The fact that you can probably see the floor out of the corner of your eye as you listen to this, or maybe you see a cobweb in the corner of the ceiling, is irrelevant to your concentration on this podcast. An unchecked or unfiltered assault on the brain by all five senses on every little thing that crosses your path during the day would make a person insane. So the brain sorts out what is and isn't important, and it makes the decision and processes only the significant stuff that maybe will keep you alive, at least according to that little alien in your head called the brain. That gives people the ability to enjoy the many colors of a rainbow without having to place a consequence or a significance on each and every subtle shade within that rainbow. In other words, the brain has natural filters that ignore stimuli that have little impact on you. The reason's obvious. If everything you saw, heard, tasted, smelled, and felt took on the importance of, say, having your hair on fire, then you simply couldn't function. You simply couldn't cope with all of the sensory input if everything was a number one priority and you had to react to every little thing. I just had a profound revelation. The solution to world peace is, ooh, look at the puppy. It's an understanding and awareness, again, episode 7, that this phenomenon exists. That's the important thing. Filters are insidious, though. It's usually easier to see when filters are in operation in others than it is to know when they're in play inside your own head. That's because it's easier to be an observer than a participant. It's why there are so many more pundits and commentators than actual world-class athletes or politicians. Your ability to be introspective, look objectively at your inner workings, and then modify your behavior to get more in alignment with the principle of effective communication is the difference between an excellent communicator and an also-ran. Let's take a look at a real example of how filters impact decisions. So there I was, riding along on my bicycle on this 10-foot wide bike path when I approached two people who were walking in the same direction as I was biking. Per the customary rule, they'd placed themselves on the right side of the path. A little farther ahead, I saw two more people also that traveled in my same direction, but on the left side of the path. Now, in order to pass the first couple, I had to move to the left lane, the normal lane of travel for passing. But there, just ahead, the second couple walked out of position and sort of in my way. Irritated, I thought, other than be careful, which I was, these irresponsible people are on the wrong side of the path. In the space of about 5 seconds, the filters in my brain categorized this situation for me. Without any conscious thought and in the blink of an eye, I developed some judgments about these people that I'd never seen before in my life. Primarily, I had the emotional reaction of irritation towards these numbskulls. First of all, they broke the rules. Now, Despite the fact that I've been known to break a rule or two, I generally respect the rules. I'm a well-ordered, logical kind of guy. Who were these people to put themselves above the rules that everyone should follow? Why, I oughta... But don't worry. No one crashed. No animals were harmed in the making of this scene. In an exhibition of my bike handling skills, I safely negotiated my way around both couples. But let's put ourselves in the left side couple's place. If the people had a legitimate reason to walk on the left side, who am I to get irritated? Thinking more openly, maybe these people came from a country where the custom is to drive or walk or bike on the left side of the road or the path. Had I known that, instead of being irritated, I might have been more inclined to help them out and maybe educate them on the custom in the United States. Maybe they were searching for a lost item. Had I known that, instead of being irritated, I might have helped them look. Maybe they saw some unusual animal and wanted to take a closer look. Had I known that, instead of being irritated, I might have gone to look with them. Now let's throw in some more considerations. Does it make any difference to the story that I'm a male? What filters come into play now? How does the situation change with that piece of information? Or does it? How about if I add that the irresponsible people appeared to me to be Asian? How about if you know that I'm of something less than 100% European descent? If the irresponsible people were both females? If the responsible couple was a man and a woman? If the responsible company or couple was of senior age? If the term couple doesn't necessarily mean two people in a relationship? All of this and more went into the reaction that I had, and all in the blink of an eye. It's a wonder that humans are ever able to communicate effectively. Consider this paraphrase from Aldous Huxley, who is an intellectual and the author of the book Brave New World. Experience is not what happens to you. Experience is how you interpret what happens to you. Now, we'll continue this discussion of filters in the next episode, so I think that's about it for today. Remember, one of the goals of this podcast is to help you improve your communication. The question for you is, how can you turn what you learned today into actions? Don't just listen to this stuff, put it into action. You'll be better off for it. To paraphrase Marshawn Lynch, it's all about that action, boss. Remember that all this stuff is applicable in the business environment too. If you'd like to find out more about how that can happen with more formal training programs, check out my management consulting website at www.theopendoorgroup.com. Talk to you next time.